In a Maryland newsroom.
The shooter is in our custody.
Tonight, what we know about the victims and what the suspect is telling police. Then,
the President of the United States right now is a subject of an ongoing criminal investigation.
Will a president under criminal investigation pick a Supreme Court justice that may rule on his case?
He asked specifically of loyalty.
Tonight, Senator Elizabeth Warren on the new push to delay a nomination until the Mueller probe is over. And as protests descend on Washington, what we know about the 2,000 kids separated from their parents by the Trump administration. But All In starts right now. Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Today, a gunman opened fire on the offices of the Capital Gazette newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland. At least 5 people were killed. Several others were injured. The first 911 calls came in at 2:34 this afternoon. Within minutes, an intern with the Capital Gazette newspaper tweeted, "Active shooter, please help us." A man whose office is across the hall from the newspaper's office described the scene.
So I was on the phone with a client and heard a loud noise, like an incredibly loud bang, and I poked my head around the corner of my desk so I could see out our front door into the front door of the Capital Gazette, and I saw a guy holding a gun. The door of the Capital Gazette had been blown to pieces. It was in shattered pieces all on the carpet, and this guy was holding what looked like a big shotgun and moving across the entrance of the Capital Gazette office, pointing the gun deeper into the office like he was targeting people.
The suspect, described as a white male in his 30s, is in custody and has been identified through facial recognition software after law enforcement officials say he was somehow able to obscure his fingerprints. Joining me now from Annapolis is NBC News correspondent Hans Nichols. Hans, what's the latest?
Yeah. Well, we're waiting on an update here that's going to start any minute, Chris. And what we know is you said 5 dead, 3 injured. And we do know that the paper is going to go out tomorrow, the Capital Gazette. And one of the reporters there, a verified reporter saying, we know this, we're going to put out a damn paper tomorrow. It gives you a sense of the resilience inside of that newsroom.
You know what, Hans?
We still don't know how many people
I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you off right there just because we're going to actually take this press conference live. Let's listen in.
A white male in his late 30s in custody. And our criminal investigation division investigators are interviewing him now. He entered the building. This was a targeted attack on the Capital Gazette that is located at 888 Bestgate Road on the first floor. He entered the building with a shotgun, and he looked for his victims as he walked through the lower level. We have secured the building. We are in the process of notifying the next of kin. We have 5 confirmed fatals and 2 injuries. The injuries, to my understanding, are superficial, possibly from glass, from the shotgun blast. We are working on now securing his residence. He does live in the state of Maryland. We are in the process of securing that residence and preparing for search warrants. So this is the next phase of this scene, and that is the investigative phase. This is the part that takes the most time. As I would assume many of you have already heard from many other police agencies in the state of Maryland and across the country, the investigative process is very difficult. We must be thorough. That's why you will not get the information from social media from us unless it's been confirmed. We have allowed our investigators to do their job. They are there now, and we are going to continue to provide you with information. I want to hold on one second. I want to share something with you that I think is important. We mentioned before about the improvised explosive device. That is not an IED. It was actually canisters of smoke grenades that he used inside of the building when he entered the establishment. So This person was prepared today to come in. This person was prepared to shoot people. His intent was to cause harm. And as I stated before, the investigative part of this is going to be thorough, and it's going to take some time. As you can see behind us, we opened up Bestgate Road. We thought that we may need to secure that roadway for a long period of time. And as we get further into the investigation, we realize that we don't need that roadway. But the building, 888 Bestgate, will be secured for some time. I do not have a time frame on that yet. We're going to be inside there for quite a bit, and until this investigation is complete. When I have more confirmed information, I will share that confirmed information with you.
You said he targeted specifically this newspaper. Exactly what was his beef with this newspaper?
That's what we're investigating now.
But there are already reports that he had a history with the newspaper a couple years ago.
That's what I'm hearing.
Chief, does he live in Annapolis?
Before we confirm that, I need our investigators to go and look into that and make sure that's correct.
Chief, does he live in Annapolis?
Difficulty initially identifying the man, that you went through a process perhaps of facial recognition to get an identification. Is that why you're able now to go to the home and do a search potentially? No, I can't share that. It's the first time I've heard facial recognition.
So, Chief, you're saying he could have been associated?
He is at our criminal investigation division. Our detectives are down there with him. I have not interrupted them to ask him if he's being...
When do you think we're going to get any more information on the suspect?
You will have the information as soon as we confirm.
Is this somebody that's known to you, Chief? Do you have a history with him?
Can you confirm if this suspect did have a connection to the Capitol Gazette? Can you tell us that?
The only connection I can tell you about right now is possibly through social media. I have no other confirmation.
Any of your department had any issues with this guy in the past or other departments?
We are still looking into that. I cannot confirm whether or not our department has come in contact with him. We will have that at a later time as well.
Have you received any comment from any family members?
Is he a resident of Maryland? Can you just tell us if he's a resident of Maryland or he came from outside?
No, he's a resident of Maryland.
Did he know weapon he was looking for? You said he was walking through looking for...
That's going to be part of the investigation. I can't confirm for you whether or not he actually knew employees there or if he just targeted the business in general.
When will you be able to confirm his identity?
Can you tell us where in Maryland he's a resident?
No.
When are you going to be able to confirm his identity, Chief?
Very soon.
Have the names.
Can you provide any information on the type of shotgun? Was it a sporting shotgun? Was it a tactical shotgun? And can you provide information about these smoke grenades, if they were commercially available or military?
I don't have that information.
Were there accomplices, sir? You said they were shot in the newspaper office.
I can't confirm that. They were shot on the first floor.
Deputy Chief, you also talked about the gunman trying to hide his identity in certain ways, maybe with his fingerprints burned off and things. Can you confirm any of that?
I cannot. It's the first I heard facial recognition and the first that I've heard anything about fingerprints. We have no verification on either.
Sir, can you confirm he has a criminal record?
I can't confirm that.
Did the Gazette have any threats against him or any threats either on social media or directly sent to that building? Do you know?
We know that there were threats sent to the Gazette through social media.
By this person?
He's in his late 30s.
By this person? Those threats were sent by this person?
No, the threats were sent over social media. We're trying to confirm what account that was, and we're trying to confirm who actually sent them.
Can you tell us anything about the broken windows in the threats?
I'm sorry, hold on one second.
How long ago were those threats?
How long ago were those threats? To my knowledge, those threats were as early as today.
Can you tell us anything about the broken windows on the fourth floor?
I can't answer that. The broken windows on the fourth floor, as I mentioned to you guys once before, we have a two-phase approach, right? One's tactical, one's investigative. Those broken windows on the fourth floor, probably, and I will confirm this, but I'm almost positive they came from our tactical guys.
Deputy Chief, are all the 5 fatalities employees of the Gazette? Are all 5 fatalities employees were employees of the Capitol?
I can't confirm that.
Have you guys seen Mr. Bell's videos?
We have not. In fact, that's a great question. In fact, we're pulling all those as we speak. We have property managers here. We have everybody that's associated with that building. Here's the interesting part. Governor Hogan and Mr. Hsu, our county executive, has mentioned this numerous times. And if you see this gentleman behind me from the Red Cross, we have had so much support from around this state not only law enforcement, but both private and public sector. And this gentleman's one of them from the Red Cross that have come and just asked what they can do. And that's important for us. We have to take care of a lot of people in a scene like this, not only police officers, but our victims' families, and then we have to get everybody back to normal, right? That's our job. So that's why we have these people here.
Chief, can you tell us anything about how he was apprehended, and did he say anything to those on?
I can't. That's part of the investigation, and when I'm able to give that information to you, I will.
Did the paper have any security in place, given the fact they got threats?
How about his age?
Late 30s.
Was there any security in the building, given the fact they were dealing with threats?
We don't know that yet. That's part of the investigation. We're looking into that as well. Based on the threats, not to my knowledge, no.
Did you wonder about his fingerprints? Does Capitol Gazette call the department to ask for any kind of protection or any kind of response to the threat?
If they have, I am not aware of that personally, but we will look into that because of those threats, and we'll get back to you on that information.
Chief, were you able to take his fingerprints?
Say that again?
Were you able to take his fingerprints?
Were we able to take his fingerprints? That'll be part of a whole booking process, yes. Eventually his fingerprints will be taken.
Reports that he used his fingerprints.
I'm sorry?
There are reports of that with his fingerprints.
Yeah, I want to be really clear about this, guys. We have no information about facial recognition or anything about his fingerprints. If I had that information, I would give it to you, but we don't have that.
Chief, as you're trying to verify the social media account, can you talk about the specificity of the threat? Can you talk about the threats? What kind of threats were made against the Capitol?
What I can share with you now is they were general threats towards the Capitol. The Capitol is a media outlet.
But I mean, was it saying, I want to kill somebody? Was it harm they were threatening? Or was it just saying, I'm never going to buy your paper again? Give us an idea of the level of threat.
It's a good question. So when I have that information available to you, I will be more specific on the threats.
Can you say that they were violent threats?
The threats were about a specific story?
No.
Can you say that they were violent threats?
They indicated violence.
Were they targeted at anyone in specific at the paper?
Politically motivated threats?
Can't answer that.
Was he targeting anyone specifically?
We do not have we have no knowledge at all that he was targeting anyone specific at the Capitol. No.
Deputy Chief, has even the Capitol talked to you at any point recently about some concerns or threats? Have they personally contacted you? Did you guys have a conversation with that?
No. Look, I want to be clear about another point. The Capitol newspaper is our local newspaper. We interact with the Capitol newspaper daily. Lieutenant Frazier is our public information officer. We have friends at the Capitol newspaper. We speak with these men and women on a daily basis to get stories out that are important to the citizens of this county. So we're here, we're invested, we're going to get this investigation right, and we're going to come back and we're going to give you credible, confirmed information to answer
Chief,
all
when do
your
you think
questions.
you're going to have a name on the suspect?
Soon.
Was there a boosted
more.
police presence after the threats were issued? Can you say whether
Say that again?
Was there a boosted
All
police
right,
presence of any?
we are going to keep an eye on that and see if any more news develops, but we've got some news here. We're learning about the investigation. I want to bring in Tom Winters, NBC News national investigative reporter. Tom.
So, Chris, the information, and the chief was just referring to a white male in his late 30s involving some threats against the paper. Our reporting here, and the reporting of my colleague Jonathan Dietz, is that the suspect's name is Jared Ramos, Jarrod Ramos. He's 38 years old. He'd been involved in a lawsuit against the paper where this shooting occurred. The lawsuit was filed in 2012, according to public court documents we've reviewed tonight, and involved a defamation case in a court in 2015. Essentially tossed that case out, saying that Ramos didn't have grounds to bring it because the report that was written off of public documents and public information. So in that instance, defamation just doesn't apply. So we don't know whether that specific article, that specific lawsuit, or anything about that led to today's shooting. We want to be clear about that. But this person did have a history with the paper. And again, it's Jared Ramos, 38 years of age, who's been identified by multiple law enforcement officials as the person responsible for today's shooting.
You know, I think immediately what happened in the environment that we're in, the people wondered if this had been essentially ideologically motivated in some way against the press in general, and it appears from the information we've learned, narrow information thus far, there was a particular it seems,
instance,
frankly,
article.
deranged beef by this individual against this paper.
Yeah, we're in the process of going through social media accounts right now to see what this person has posted and whether or not some of those postings are authentic. But if they are authentic, then they're very clearly targeted at a specific reporter in a specific article in a specific paper. This specific paper, the reporter that was involved in this lawsuit is no longer with the paper. It's important to note. But it does appear that this individual had a specific tie to the paper. I know folks have wondered if there was a broader ideology here. Right. Frankly, it's just too soon to say, and police have not stated a particular motive. But obviously, there is a nexus here. There's a history here.
There's a history and a history of conflict. I mean, he sued this newspaper,
Absolutely.
according to public documents, about something they wrote that he did not like.
That's right. And the suit went on for 3 years and was eventually overturned. But yes, there was a significant history in the public cases.
We know that there was some concern, I think out of a surfeit of caution, there were NYPD deployed outside media entities today. Again, I think in the absence of knowledge of a motive, whether there was something broader here than this particular paper.
You know, the NYPD is uniquely situated and uniquely prepared to send heavily armed units to specific locations based on threats that happen. We see that if there's a terrorism attack overseas, if it happens in a subway, the NYPD responds on the subway. It's something that they have the ability to do, the resources to do. So we see that here in New York City. Before AIR became aware that there may be some other cities that are doing that. But as we learn more about the motive and what drove today's shooting, then obviously police departments will react to that, whether this is a longer term protection or whether this is something that appears to be very isolated to this newspaper. It's just something we're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, the last mass shooting is sort of similar in this profile, the YouTube shooting, which again is sort of similar trajectory, the sort of horror at the thought of it, the sort of questions about whether this was broad, a broad targeting.
Somebody trying to send a broad message.
Someone trying to send a broad message, ideologically motivated, and then that appears to have been a deeply deranged individual with a violent vendetta against specifically YouTube.
Exactly.
Again, as the pieces fall into place here, we should note that the very diligent and brave men and women of the newspaper there in Annapolis are putting their newspaper out. It's a small newsroom. People are talking about the shocking loss of life and how it feels like family there. And so, of course, we send our condolences to those individuals on what is undoubtedly the most difficult, if not one of the most difficult days of their life. Tom Winter, thank you for your reporting.
Yeah.
We'll be right back after this. All right, the President of the United States, who's at the center of a major criminal probe, now gets to appoint another justice to the Supreme Court, which may end up being akin to picking his own jury. It remains an open question whether the president or his campaign conspired with Russia, a foreign adversary, to sabotage the 2016 election in order to take the White House. It is also an open question whether the president has since then used his office to obstruct justice and impede the investigation into his campaign, his family, associates, and himself. But that investigation has already uncovered a range of crimes. Tonight, the president's former campaign chairman sits in jail after being indicted for money laundering and other charges. Paul Manafort's bail was revoked after he allegedly tried to tamper with witnesses after the fact. And the first of his 2 trials is scheduled to start in less than a month. Besides Manafort, the president's deputy campaign chairman, who also worked on his transition, pleaded guilty to a felony and is cooperating with investigators. His national security advisor pleaded guilty and cooperating. One of his foreign policy advisors pleaded guilty and is cooperating. And while the president is under investigation, he continues, in effect, to collude with Russia out in the open, just as he did during the campaign.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
This morning, on the same day the White House announced a one-on-one summit with Vladimir Putin next month, the president sided with Putin yet again over the conclusions of the U.S. intelligence community and the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee, tweeting, "Russia continues to say they had nothing to do with meddling in our election." That's 130 days till the midterm elections. The president is very clearly signaling to Russia that they will not be held accountable for anything they do now to interfere with American democracy. He is essentially saying, just go right ahead. And that is the context in which this president now gets to pick a new Supreme Court justice. A president, let's remember, who once asked the FBI director for his personal loyalty and who rails against the Attorney General for failing to shield him from a criminal probe. All of that matters because the Supreme Court will almost certainly be asked to rule on some of the most sensitive and significant aspects of the Mueller investigation. They will likely be asked to rule on what the President of the United States can get away with. The president's lawyer has already threatened a legal battle with the special counsel, telling ABC News, quote, if Mueller tries to subpoena us, we're going to court.
A president can go before a judge and say it's for purposes of harassment, it's unnecessary. We win that.
And that's what you intend to do if you're subpoenaed?
Oh, gosh, yeah. We'll say, hey, you got everything you need. You got everything you need. What do you need us for?
The president's own nominee can end up being the decisive vote in determining, among many other questions, whether the president himself has to testify in the Mueller probe. I asked Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren if that possibility concerns her.
Yes, it concerns me deeply. And, you know, I know how often we say never before in history, but never before in history have we been in a position where a president who can hear the hoofbeats of an investigation that is bearing down on him gets to name the person who is likely to be the swing vote in the court that will ultimately determine a big part of how any investigation goes forward.
Given what we know about how the president operates and what James Comey has said, are you confident that he is not personally or using his powers in these interviews to essentially get pledges of loyalty, to ask inappropriate questions about what these people will do if asked to rule on him?
You know, look, the president has already made his history clear that he wants to screen nominees for personal loyalty to him. That's his established track record. That's not anything that's a surprise. And so, you know, we all say, look at what he's done before and watch what he's doing right now as he's talking with potential Supreme Court nominees. But let me say on this is all the more reason that the United States Senate cannot simply be a rubber stamp. You know, Donald Trump is not king. He does not get to wave his scepter and then someone magically appears on the United States Supreme Court. That's not how this thing works. Every single senator gets a vote. And unless Donald Trump's nominee can get a majority of those votes, they don't get to go to the United States Supreme Court. And as you know, we are a closely divided Senate right now. I think there's going to be a very serious investigation into whomever Donald Trump names.
The last question on this sort of line of reasoning, which is, do you think it would be appropriate for the justice to recuse him or herself, were they to be confirmed, or to tell you in the hearings that they would recuse themselves from issues that directly bear on the president vis-a-vis the investigation?
You know, it's a very interesting question. I'm going to leave it there because I think it's one, we've got all kinds of uncharted territory here that we're going to have to keep sorting through. As I said, this is just something we've never faced before in history. And I think there are going to be some really tough questions put to whoever the nominee is. But let's talk about what we know for sure is at stake and some of the questions that the nominee is going to face. Donald Trump has already said that he's going to pick somebody who has been pre-screened off a list that was put together by a group whose number one job, an extremist group, is to make sure that Roe versus Wade gets overturned. This means that he's looking for a nominee who will criminalize abortion and try to punish women. That's what's at stake in this one. And then from there, so much more. This is about healthcare cases that are percolating up through the courts, including the one we know about right now about pre-existing conditions. This is about the swing vote in our environmental protections, whether or not giant corporations are going to have the right to poison the water and foul the air. This is about workers' rights and whether or not the Supreme Court is going to stay on the path of trying to bust unions. This is about voting rights, whether or not democracy fundamentally works in this country. And this is one of those moments where Justice Kennedy has been the swing swing vote, look, and I'll be blunt, he's swung a lot of times in a direction I don't like, but he's been a swing vote. He was the one who helped stand up for equal marriage. All of that is now at risk when Donald Trump gets to replace the swing vote with somebody off a pre-approved extremist list.
Another area that they will have some say over is immigration. There's a federal ruling that he has to reunite the families. It's unclear how they will proceed. There was a protest this morning in the Hart Senate office building, about 600 women in aluminum blankets. What did you make of that protest?
So I was there. I saw them. I had just come out of Democratic caucus. This is how I see it. Look, we don't have the votes on the Democratic side by ourselves to stop anything. But I remember the day that Donald Trump was sworn in. I remember going home that night and thinking they're going to roll back the Affordable Care Act for tens of millions of people. They're going to do it next week because they've got the House, they got the Senate, they got the White House. They're going to do this. And then the next day, I went to the Women's March, the biggest protest rally in the history of the world. What we still had on our side was the capacity to raise our voices. And all that spring and into the summer, as millions of people across this country, Democrats, Republicans, independents, said, my government will hear my voice. Do not take away health care from tens of millions of Americans. Do not permit insurance companies to discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. We had our voices. And look, as I stand here right now, I just got back from the border on Monday. But as I stand here right now, I remind myself, 2 weeks ago, it was the official policy of the United States government to take babies out of the arms of mothers who came here to ask for asylum. And now that policy has changed. We got a lot of problems still at the border. Yeah. That's what the women were there in the lobby of our building to protest. But that's the point. Yeah. We still have the power of people. We have the power of our voices. I'm in this fight all the way, and I'm counting on the fact that there are millions of other Americans who are in it too.
Senator Elizabeth Warren, it's great to have you.
It's good to be here.
For more on whether the president should be able to appoint a Supreme Court justice while he's under investigation, I'm joined by former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman and Vanita Gupta, former head of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. Harry, let me start with you. Senator Warren called it uncharted territory, and it does feel to me like it's uncharted territory. Do you think so?
Well, look, it stinks. It's rank. It would never fly in the schoolyard. But the Senate is the law of the jungle, and I don't know if any rules apply. Is it uncharted? Not really, Chris, right? The U.S. versus Nixon court that effectively ended his presidency included 3 of his own nominees. Clinton versus Jones court that gave Clinton headaches leading to impeachment included 2 of his nominees. Maybe the most infamous, Bush versus Gore. Well, those weren't W's nominees, but it has happened. And the standards don't really speak to it unless there's some impression of impartiality. It sure stinks to high heaven, but I think there will be precedents for the Mitch McConnells of the world to point to.
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear here. There's no rules here. There's just what the power of politics.
Law of the jungle.
Yeah, exactly. What the power of politics can get away with. My point here isn't that it's not allowed or is allowed. My point is that there's like a very clear conflict that they're headed towards, Vanita, and it's particularly razor sharp to me for this reason. We know the president had James Comey into the White House to basically say, like, hey, are you going to look out for me? We know he asked him, like, will you go easy on Flynn? We know that Mueller is front of mind, and he's going to be going into these interviews with these individuals that he knows are going to sit possibly in judgment of things relevant to him. And it just seems totally plausible that he is using that opportunity to try to extract things from them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's based on a pre-existing record that we know. There are all of these pieces of evidence that show that the president prizes loyalty above everything else. And he has even, you know, with this, he's made it clear that he believes he is above the law. And the Supreme Court will be the final say about what happens, whether he can be compelled to testify, whether he can pardon family members, whether he can be subject to prosecution. You know, and so that loyalty test, it's hard to imagine that he isn't going to be asking some of those same questions. I think right now, the rule of law and democracy is at stake with the Justice Kennedy seat, on top of course, everything else, like access to health care, like women's abilities to control our bodies. He's made it clear that he's been bragged during the election that he would only appoint judges who would reverse Roe versus Wade, LGBTQ rights, civil rights, criminal justice, all of that. The Supreme Court touches on everything that we care about. But also more broadly, given the state of the fact that he's under federal criminal investigation, we also have a much bigger issue here at stake, which is fundamentally the rule of law.
You know, Harry, you mentioned those two precedents, and it's interesting, right, to think about those, right? Because the idea that going forward here, and it came up a little bit in Gorsuch, is these individuals, they may have ideological predispositions that accord with the president and the Federal Society and conservatives, but they're people of integrity, and you can fundamentally trust them to do the right thing when sitting in judgment and not sort of act as loyal vassals to the White House. And I guess the question is, like, how much is that faith preserved at this particular moment in American governance?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there's an irony here. If they do it and get away with it, it would be in large part because of the institutional prestige that the court has developed over many years from opinions like U.S. versus Nixon, where they did the right thing. And that would permit them in some ways under cloak of that to get away with it. One quick point to note practically, if there were an attempt to kind of delay things, the pushback immediately would be, oh my God, the Supreme Court can't function with 8 people. In the past, justices, when they've stepped down, have done it subject to the confirmation of their successors, not Kennedy. He's done at the end of July. So any effort to use this as a delay will fall. And it's ironic because, of course, he took office in the middle of the term after the big delay and knows about the impediments to the court, but he's gone. So that will actually give a talking point to Republicans to say, we have to get on with this. The poor Supreme Court can't do its work.
Final question, Vanita. It strikes me that if you're the person, if you're Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, and you're the one who's got to take these nominees around to meet the president, you can't let them be alone in the room with him for the risk of him doing something that will put them in an impossible spot under oath in a hearing.
You know, I would think so, but of course, you know, it was unprecedented for the Attorney General to leave Jim Comey in the office alone with the president in the manner he did. So, you know, let's just say Leonard Leo's got a real axe to grind about the kind of nominee that he wants. He's created the 25-member shortlist that Trump has relied on, and all of those judges have passed his fealty test and have made their agenda very clear, too. So, you know, it may not be in his interest to assume that he's going to be some kind of protective shield that way.
Harry Litman and Vanita Gupta.
And forgive me, Chris, one quick point, which is all the obfuscation will go on about cases in judicial philosophy, but they'll get this question directly. Did anyone say anything? And that they'll have to answer.
Exactly. Harry Litman and Vanita Gupta, thank you both for joining me. Ahead, the weekend's mass protests against the Trump family separation policy have begun. What we know about how these children are being reunited as children as young as 3 get their own court dates. And next, newly unsealed court filings show Paul Manafort, the president's campaign chair, owed millions of dollars to a Russian oligarch when he signed on to the campaign. Those details after the break. Why would a man who is $10 million in debt take a job where he doesn't get paid? Weird, right? We now know that's exactly what the now jailed Paul Manafort did when he took a job running Donald Trump's campaign back in 2016. It appears that Manafort saw the job as a financial opportunity despite the lack of salary. Just a short time after he was first hired by Trump, Manafort sent an email asking, quote, "How do we use to get whole?" Meaning, how do we use my new job to get whole? How do we use to get whole? Manafort sent that email to a guy you may remember named Konstantin Kilimnik, who had worked for Manafort in Ukraine. He has since been indicted by Robert Mueller and fled to Russia. And the person they were apparently trying to get whole with was this guy, who you also may know, Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, one of Russia's richest men, who has close ties to the Kremlin. Yesterday, a newly unsealed filing from Mueller revealed that Deripaska had loaned $10 million to a Manafort business. $10 million, which he presumably wanted back. So just to be absolutely clear, the guy who was running Donald Trump's campaign during the summer, when he was running it for free and the Russians were sabotaging the election, also just happened to be in debt $10 million to a Russian oligarch with close ties to Vladimir Putin at the very same time that Vladimir Putin and his government were working to get Trump elected president. Joining me now for the latest on the investigation, MSNBC contributor Natasha Bertrand, staff writer at The Atlantic, covering national security and the Russia investigation, and Michael Isikoff, chief investigative correspondent at Yahoo News, co-author of Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. Michael, it was always unclear to me the made whole was ambiguous in two different directions, right? Do you want to get whole because the guy owes you money, or do you want to get whole because you owe him money? This seems to resolve that fairly definitively.
Yeah, there were multiple financial ties between Manafort and Deripaska. This new information about the $10 million loan comes on top of other reporting, which goes back to that I did during the 2016 campaign about how Manafort had gotten into a dispute with Deripaska over a $19 million cable deal in Ukraine. Deripaska thought Manafort had ripped him off. The money that he had put up for the venture had gone missing. But what's really significant here and why this is so important to the larger Mueller investigation is you said that Deripaska has close ties to the Kremlin. We should flesh that out a little bit. Deripaska was described in WikiLeaks cables written by a U.S. ambassador a few years ago as one of the 2 or 3 oligarchs closest to Putin. In Russian Roulette, we report how when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, in her meetings with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, he would repeatedly bring up the question of Deripaska because Deripaska couldn't get a U.S. visa because the FBI had concerns about his ties to organized crime. The concerns that the FBI have been more recently fleshed out when Deripaska just a couple of months ago was sanctioned by the Treasury Department, in which they described the intelligence they had on Deripaska, his involvement in extortion, racketeering, bribery, the murder of a businessman in a dispute, and these organized crime ties. So here you had a oligarch with these organized crime ties who is so tied in with the Kremlin that the Russian foreign minister is pressing the U.S. Secretary of State to give him a visa, and the campaign chairman for the Trump campaign was in hock to this guy who's pressing him for the money that that he owes him. And then Manafort's response is, we'll give him private briefings about what's going on inside the Trump campaign.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy, he's waking up every day owing this guy $10 million, which seems like just thinking about it puts a knot in my stomach. And he gets on the campaign, the first thing he's like, how can I use this position? It's like the Blagojevich thing. I've got this, and it's effing golden, right? I've got this thing, which is I'm campaign manager for Donald Trump. How do I use it? Another person in the inner Trump orbit, Natasha, who seems to really be in a tough spot is Roger Stone. We know that he has not been contacted by Mueller directly for an interview, and then today, an ex-aide, another one, former aide to Roger Stone, subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury hearing evidence of the Russia investigation and to hand over documents. What is your sense of where Stone is in terms of Mueller's sights?
Well, it seems like everyone has been interviewed by Mueller except for Roger Stone, and that should be extremely worrisome to Roger Stone because it shows that he's kind of trying to get to the people closest to him in order to figure out what Roger Stone knew about what happened during the election before they actually get to maybe subpoenaing Roger Stone himself. I think that Roger Stone is really the key to possibly the key to understanding who was behind the Podesta hack and whether or not the campaign coordinated it in any way with WikiLeaks. The same goes for, if you have that key, then the same goes potentially for who knew in the campaign about the DNC hack. I mean, it's all kind of the same actors who hacked Podesta's email, the Russians, and who hacked the DNC. So if you have Roger Stone and if you have the answer as to whether he was communicating with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks throughout the campaign, then perhaps you have a clue as to whether or not there was an intermediary who was feeding WikiLeaks this stolen information that the Russians stole from the DNC and stole from John Podesta and then gave to the campaign.
Michael, do you anticipate, we're going to get get a trial of Manafort unless something changes. I mean, do you anticipate, you've been reporting this very heavily for a while now, like learning new things in that trial? It's going to be quite a spectacle, I imagine.
Oh, sure. And look, it is quite common for prosecutors to hold some of their best stuff back. And one can expect, if this trial does come in July, when it's scheduled for, that we're going to be learning a whole lot more about just how much they know about Manafort and these ties. But also, you know, there is so much that could well be coming to a head this summer. The wide expectation here is that Mueller is likely to do something in the next couple of months. He can't wait until after Labor Day. He can't do something during the election unless he be criticized for doing the same thing Jim Comey did. So we may well be coming to a very critical juncture, and it's, you know, ironic or, you know, pretty significant that this is coming at the same time that there's going to be those Supreme Court hearings about that next Supreme Court justice.
Natasha, does that scan with what your reporting indicates as well?
I have not heard that the collusion aspect of this investigation is going to wrap up by the fall. It's possible that there's going to be a major indictment, perhaps, that related to collusion that does come out before the midterms, and in that way we have kind of a conclusion to the collusion part of the investigation, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to wrap up. But there's just so much that we still don't know. We still don't know, for example, why 3 different people approached the Trump campaign before the summer of 2016, offering them dirt on Hillary Clinton, offering Hillary Clinton emails. We don't really know anything about this shadowy professor, Joseph Mifsud. We don't know anything about Henry Greenberg, the Russian who approached Michael Caputo. We don't know, for example, what Carter Page was doing in Moscow, whether he did make a deal with Rosneft. So these are all things that Manafort, or that Mueller, is looking into now, and whether or not we actually get an answer to all of those questions in the next 4 months, it just does not seem plausible.
Natasha Bertrand and Michael Isikoff, thanks to you both.
Thanks, Chris.
Still ahead, the fallout from the Trump family separation policy continues. What we know about the more than 2,000 children who have yet to be reunited with their parents, coming up.